Anyway, now, turning to the Qur'an and the Shia attitude toward the Qur'an. One of the challenges that the Sunnis used to throw in the face of Shiites when they began teaching their teachings about the elevated status of the Imams, they said, well, why doesn't the Qur'an talk about this? This is a very important belief. It should be there very clearly in the Qur'an. So what's the response? Well, there was a number of responses. One of them was that, well, the Qur'an that you all have, it's not the real Qur'an. And that's definitely a part of their historical tradition. You have in the Kafi of Kulaini, you have these references to something called Mushaf Fatima, the version of the Quran that was in Fatima's keeping, apparently, and it was many times larger than the Quran that we have. And there's numerous narrations about that concept. And then they say that that the Sahaba completely changed it, and that the reason that they changed it was to edit out all references to the Imams, or as many as were clear and obvious. And so you have one of the tafsirs that's attributed to one of the Imams, called the Tafseer of Hasan al-Askari. Here's a quote from that. Those whose ambitions overcame their wisdom falsified the true meaning of God's book and altered it. And harrafu wa ghayyaru. And then there's a whole series of such narrations in a book called Kitab al-Qira'at. It's also called Kitab al-Tanzil wa Tahrif, by a scholar named Ahmad bin Muhammad al-Sayyari, who was alive in the 3rd century, in the second half of the 3rd century, after the Hijrah. And also one of the famous early commentaries, al Ayyaashee, is also in the 3rd century. Quote from that: had the book of God and the book of Allah not been subject to additions and omissions, our righteousness would not have been hidden from any person of wisdom. In another such narration, the Qur'an contained the names of various persons, but these names have been removed. And then there's a narration that's supposedly transmitted through or from Ja'far as-Sadiq, that one day Abdullah bin Amr ibn al-As was coming out of the house of Uthman, and he bumped into the Amir al-Mu'mineen, meaning in their parlance, that was Ali, even though at that time, according to the majority rule, it was Uthman. So Abdullah ibn Amr, he bumps into Ali and he says, "Oh Ali, we've spent the night on a matter with which we hope Allah will strengthen this community." So he seems to be alluding to the compilation of the Quran. Of course, Uthman wasn't, he didn't have direct day-to-day, managing the details contact with that. It was turned over to Zayd ibn Thabit and a committee. Anyway, Ali answered him, "I know how you spent the night. You have falsified, altered, and changed 900 letters or words, harf. You've falsified 300 letters or words. You've changed 300 letters or words, and you've altered 300 letters or words." And then he recited وَيْلٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَكْتُبُونَ الْكِتَابَ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ ثُمَّ يَقُولُونَ هَذَا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. Woe to those who write the book with their hands and then say, this is from Allah. Verse 79 from Al-Baqarah. So, and these various terms, غَيَّرُوا, حَرَّفُوا, بَدَّلُوا, they don't refer to anything there's no difference between those words and meaning. And they're not discrete falsification techniques, in other words. And then you have a famous statement by Muhammad al-Baqir that's always quoted by the Shi'ite commentators. The Qur'an was revealed consisting of 4 parts, 1 part concerning us, the Shia, 1 part concerning our enemies, 1 part commandments and regulations, and 1 part customs and parables, sunan wa'amthal. And the exalted parts of the Qur'an refer to us. So all of that indicates that, well, yeah, there was something about them, and it was taken out. And then eventually, those kinds of charges were muted around the beginning of the 4th century. And so, some of the people who were exponents of that later, more moderate view, famous names among them, Shaykh al-Mufid, whose given name was Muhammad ibn Nu'man, Sharif al-Murtada, Abu Ja'far al-Tusi, and Abu Ali al-Fadl ibn al-Hasan al-Tabarsee. And we're going to look at Tabarsee's Tafsir in particular. They had a somewhat different view. They said that although the text of the Qur'an as we have it is, okay, it's not complete, it doesn't contain any falsifications. In other words, the words that are there are the words that were revealed. It's just not all the words. Now, in recent times, during the Safavid era, the Safavids were a Sufi order that became a Shiite Sufi order. They started out as a Sunni Sufi order. They turned into a Shiite Sufi order, and they ended up conquering Iran around the late 1500s, something like that. And they forcibly imposed Shiism upon Iran as a whole. Before that, there were plenty of Sunnis in Iran. There still are some, but the persecution drove some of them out, and some apparently stayed but changed just to accommodate the Inquisition-like pressure of the Safavids. During that Safavid era, this issue was again raised, and in the 1800s, late 1800s, there was a book that was published in Iran called فصل الخطاب في تحريف كتاب رب الأرباب by another scholar named Tabarsee. Tabarsee is just a nisba. It's a reference to where the person came from, Tabaristan. This is the same place that Tabari came from, so 2 different ways of referring to the same place. And again, there are people in our era who say no. Those people were extremists. The mainstream position is that we read the same Qur'an as you do, and this is a fact that if the Qur'an that the Sunnis are reading is not the Qur'an, then and you have some other Qur'an, then why don't you use it in your salat and when you recite the Qur'an out loud? They never do that. Okay, so one of their responses to why isn't there anything in the Qur'an about your belief, one of them was to say, well, the Qur'an has been changed. Another response was to say, well, it's there, but it's not real in your face. You know, there are hidden meanings there that have to be pulled out. And another important technique they used was something that was very similar to a Sunni principle of fiqh and exegesis. They said, look, the Qur'an only deals with generalities, and the details are left to the reports, al-akhbar. In our context, reports from the Prophet ﷺ. In their context, reports from the Imams. And still, I mean, the response to that from the Sunnis would be, wait a minute, this is, the Quran deals with fundamental principles. And this, what you're claiming is a fundamental principle. So there's a big difference between having a general order for establishing salah and not mentioning 4 rakats for dhuhr, and not really mentioning the imamat at all. This is a general principle. It should be there in the Quran. Anyway, so one of their fallback positions was that, well, the Quran hints at it, and then the details are expounded in our traditions, which, of course, from our point of view, are fabrications. To give an example of one of these reports that presents this idea, Muhammad al-Baqir, who was the 5th Imam, was asked by one of his disciples why Ali is not mentioned in the Quran. He said, if people ask you that, say, Allah revealed to His Messenger about Salat and did not explicitly mention 3 or 4 until this was, rakats, I guess, until this was interpreted by the Messenger. So also He revealed about Hajj, but He didn't give details about making tawaf 7 times. And so, the meaning of the verse, وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ وَأُولِي الْأَمْرِ مِنْكُمْ. And verse 59 from Surah An-Nisa. He said that's the mention of Ali. And then the details are in the narrations. And when you look at Shi'ite Tafseers, especially the early ones, they don't deal with all the verses of the Quran. The only verses they're interested in are verses that will they can somehow extract from it support for their principles about the Imams and their mystical qualities and the duty of loyalty to the Imams and to disavow anybody, to be an enemy with anybody who doesn't accept their exalted status in the way that the Shiites understand it. Now, one of the things that the Shiites, one of the textual cornerstones for their understanding of the role of the Imams in Tafsir, that there's a hadith that's narrated by various wordings. The Prophet ﷺ said, I'm leaving amongst you thaqalain. I'm leaving amongst you 2 heavy things. One is the Book of Allah, and the other is my family. And there's a version of that in Sahih Muslim. There's a version that says, I'm leaving amongst you 2 heavy things, the Book of Allah and my Sunnah. That's reported with a broken isnad in the Muwatta of Imam Malik, and it's also reported in the Seerah of Ibn Hisham. I'm not sure about the isnad of Ibn Hisham's. And then there are some narrations which would seem to, the Shiite narrations would seem to make an explicit link between the Book of Allah and the family of the Prophet ﷺ, and that they would not separate until they meet at the Hawd on the Day of Judgment. And so the Shiites use that then to say that the Imams are the ones that are supposed to be making the Tafseer of the Qur'an. Now, the way the Sunnis understand those is that they're not explicitly linked, that Allah or the Prophet ﷺ is ordering us to pay strict attention, to hold fast to the Book of Allah, and to show due respect to his household, which is the Bani Hashim and the Bani Muttalib. Now, if we look at what happened to Tafsir as history stretched out for the Shiites. Okay, originally they were extremely ma'thur oriented. Okay, because now their whole rationale for the Imams and the status of the Imams and their attitude toward the Imams is that they have the special knowledge. They're infallible, and whatever they say, that's right. So who's going to interpret the Qur'an except by their statements? So among the early works of Shi'ite Tafseer, you have complete ma'thur, and the compiler doesn't say a word. And then as time stretches on, then the compiler starts to make some comments about the traditions, and then they start to make more and more comments, and then they start to add linguistic analysis, and the same kind of process that was going on in Sunni Tafsir, you see it being paralleled in Shiite Tafsir, but with a sort of a time lag. They lag behind the Sunnis in that. Eventually, when there's no Imams around anymore to ask, then becomes an easier matter for people to start interpreting. Now you have to interpret the traditions of the Imam along with the original text. So you can't, there's no living Imam there to ask. So it opened the door then for Tafseer al Ra'y among the Shiites. And because of, during the Buwayhid era, around 300, in the 4th century, in the 4th century, the Buwayhids became the dominant political power in Iraq and Iran, and they were still an Abbasid Khalifa, but they were the kingmakers. They were the military power, and they were Persian-speaking Shiites, and they were also fairly tolerant toward the Mu'tazilites, and so where they ruled, you had the Mu'tazilites flourishing and the Shiites flourishing, and there was a lot of contact between the two. And the Shiites picked up a lot of outlook from the Mu'tazilites.